Welcome in, Push Nation. Here we are, Tuesday night. We didn't have class today, so the goal tonight is going to be to fill in the gaps and make sure that we cover some hard-hitting information about the war in Europe. Now, this evening, you're also going to get some information about the war in the Pacific, and that's going to be covered on our student Fireside chat. So by the time you've watched theirs and mine, you'll have a good sense of the military conflict and how it was erupting in World War II. And this will kind of be a way for us to cover this information without sacrificing too much class time. Now, as far as the war in Europe is concerned, keep in mind that by 1942, when the Allies, the Americans finally, when the Americans finally decided to get involved in the war, it was the Soviet Union who had primarily been fighting the Germans throughout most of 1941 and into 1942. The British had slowly begun to engage the Germans in North Africa. And Stalin was really putting a lot of pressure on the American government and the British government to really open up a second front against the Germans. And that second front would be in North Africa. So the first American troops in battle fought against the Germans in North Africa. And the name of the operation where the Allies invaded North Africa with the intent to conquer the Germans there was known as Operation Torch. And Torch was a really important military operation, primarily because, again, the objective was to take North Africa back from the Germans, which was strategic for many reasons, primarily being trade in the Mediterranean and also oil. But the Germans were seasoned fighters, and the Americans were just entering the war for the first time. And it took the United States and the British a few battles to really get to where they meshed and gelled, and there was a lot of internal conflict between the two allied groups in terms of who would give orders and what units would take the front and the lead on certain battles. And so there was a tug and pull that made it somewhat difficult for the Allies at first to gel in fighting back the Germans. And Germany's greatest resource, perhaps in the fight for North Africa, was one of their key generals named Erwin Rommel. And Rommel was, without a doubt, one of Hitler's greatest assets as a military leader. And Rommel got the nickname from his prolific defense of the German territories in the North Africa, and he was called the Desert Fox. And Rommel would go on to prove himself to be one of the most important German military minds all throughout the entire World War II. So by 1943, however, despite the Desert Fox's success, the Allies would go on to defeat the Germans and start to really push them out of North Africa. Following the Allies' opening of North Africa in 1943, we actually get one of the first major conferences of World War II. And all told, you'll be responsible for 3 conferences, to know all 3 conferences. Because in each of these conferences, some really important decisions were made by the Allies and their big 3 leaders. And one of the first conferences I want you guys to really be familiar with is it's the conference, the Tehran Conference, And this took place in Iran, so modern-day Iran, in the city of Tehran. Now, the Tehran Conference took place in November of 1943. And by the time that Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt met in the winter of 1943, the American and British had already began an invasion of Italy, which was the second phase of the European military objective, was to invade Italy and go after Mussolini and the German forces in Italy. So that invasion was already underway when the big 3 met in Tehran. And really, one of the major goals of this meeting, above all, was Stalin was asking Churchill and Roosevelt to continue to put more pressure on the Germans. Now, by the time that the Tehran Conference had occurred, Stalin and his military had already defeated the Germans at the Battle of Stalingrad, which I would argue is maybe one of the greatest victories of the Allies in the entire war. And so Stalin began to really push for FDR and Churchill to take on the responsibility of again, collapsing the Germans and pushing on the Germans from multiple fronts. Well, the last front to really be opened in 1943, 1944 was France, which had fallen under the Nazis in 1940. And so that's really where the beginning of the plans for what would become Operation Overlord. Operation Overlord, which was the planned invasion of France. This is where the seeds for that operation were planted. Another important development of Tehran was the formation of a new Allied military command structure. Think back to what I just recently said about North Africa and some of the in-house fighting that was occurring between the British and the United States. Well, to sort of solve that crisis, the Allies created what was known as SHAEF. And SHAEF is an acronym for the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF. And SHAEF was really a turning point in the way the Allies waged World War II, because the setbacks that they experienced early on in North Africa really taught the Allies an important lesson, which is they needed to be on the same page when it came to planning campaigns and invasions of Europe. And SHAEF was ultimately headed by future U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower. So he took control of SHAEF. So we had an American general that was in charge of SHAEF. And it would be Eisenhower whose finger would be on the button, pushing a lot of the decisions for the eventual invasion of France. So Tehran occurs at the end of 1943. SHAEF is formed. Meanwhile, the Allies would continue to work their way through Italy. And by 1943, Mussolini would be out in power, and he suffered a gruesome death of public capital murder. He was hanged and mutilated in public. And so by 1943, Italy was all but out, and that left just the Nazi forces entrenched in Italy for the American and British to clean up. And that allowed the United States and allies to really focus itself on the invasion of France. And the invasion of France would go on to become one of the most daring operations ever planned. And one of the chief issues that the Allies had in invading France, of course, was that the Nazis had surrounded all of Western Europe and had an ally in the Spanish government with Franco, who was a fellow fascist like Hitler, even though Spain was relatively out of the war. So for the Allies to invade France, there's only one way for them to go, and that was to cross the English Channel, which, let's face it, any amphibious landing, as we're going to hear from the fellas in the Pacific on the other Fireside chat, amphibious landings, even in modern war, just you're asking a lot of the soldiers, and everything has to go exactly to plan. So what SHAEF and Eisenhower and the British commanders in SHAEF, what they began to do was craft one of the most intricate pre-invasion operations in possibly world history. And the name of this operation was called Operation Fortitude. This is really just fascinating. And I hope that if you guys are intrigued by what I'm about to say in the next few minutes, that you guys take it upon yourselves to look up some of this information, because it just really is mind-boggling. So, again, to invade France meant that the Allies would have to cross the English Channel. So what the Americans and British and the French resistance movement, which was fighting the Nazis within France on a small scale, what the Allies basically did was they created a dummy army of phony tanks and planes and factory sites all throughout the coast of England. Literally, it was a dummy army. And when I say dummy army, most of these fake tanks and planes, they were actually inflatable tanks or inflatable planes. And the Allies used an intricate network of fake messages that they put out on the radio, fake Morse code. They planted all sorts of false information in reports, thanks to the help of the French resistance. And what they were aiming to do here with Operation Fortitude was create the idea of a disguise. They wanted to disguise that their invasion was not going to take place where it really was. So the Allies deked the Germans into thinking that the invasion was going to take place on a region of France known Pas de Calais, which was the narrowest part between the English Channel, between France and England. So they set up, the Allies set up all these fake operations, and they talked about Eisenhower leading the invasion, and even General George Patton, who of course I've mentioned before, was one of the most famous World War II generals. And all these bells and whistles were brought together in Operation Fortitude, with the intent being to really sell the Germans on a fake invasion. Meanwhile, for months, the Allies were planning what would go down to become the invasion at Normandy, or as you guys probably know it as D-Day. So this is really, again, one of the most interesting stories I can share about the invasion of France, because a lot of people don't realize that Operation Fortitude really was the key to succeeding. If that operation had not been so successful in deking the Germans, there's no way Normandy, the landings at Normandy, would have been as successful as they were. Because had the Germans, who had by this point had built up France, they had an intricate network of defense all throughout the coastline of France that was named the Atlantic Wall. And who did Hitler put in charge of Atlantic Wall, by the way, in 1944? The Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, his best general. And so Rommel had put up all these defenses and troops and artillery and big guns. And the idea was, if the Americans and British were coming into France, they would have to go through really hell to do so. So the fact that the Allies sold the Germans on Pas de Calais as the landing site was really to the key to the invasion of France succeeding on June 6, 1944. And when those Allied ships hit the 5 different beaches at Normandy, the casualty rates were grossly lower than anyone had expected, because of the fact that the Germans didn't have their strongest defenses up in the Normandy region of France. And speaking of D-Day, I've always been fascinated by the invasion of France, because it's been popularized in the media, and it's been popularized in films like Saving Private Ryan, which is a great film if you're looking for as close as you can imagine what the invasion of Normandy would be. But D-Day was really one of the most daring operations, even though the Germans didn't have their full defenses. The United States and British forces that landed on the 5 different beaches, which, by the way, were Omaha Beach, Utah Beach. Those are the 2 beaches that the United States landed on. You had Gold Beach and Sword Beach, which is where the British landed, and also the Canadians landed at Juno Beach, which is really neat because my wife's grandfather actually was there. He landed with the Canadian 3rd Infantry at Juno Beach on June 6, 1944. So that's a really strong point of pride in her family, that her grandfather was actually part of the landings on D-Day. And so really, it just was one of the most remarkable achievements in military history, to land upwards of 500,000 troops eventually crossed over the beaches on June 6th. And what made the landings even more memorable and special was that in the early stages of June 6th, so in the wee hours of June 6th, you had hundreds of thousands of paratroopers who fought their way behind German enemy lines by landing. They jumped out of airplanes and they landed behind German enemy lines. And that's when they fought their way towards the beaches, so that when the troops came from the beaches, they could link up with the paratroopers. And this is where you get the paratroopers have been immortalized in books like Band of Brothers, which was a TV series as well. If you're looking for a really great nonfiction read on the paratroopers' role in World War II, the Band of Brothers is really one of the best I've ever read. So it's just remarkable what the Allies were able to pull off, bringing that many troops, bringing that many men on shore to pull off Operation Fortitude. Altogether, 13 countries contributed to Overlord, which is the invasion of France. You had total of almost 12,000 vessels, 12,000 aircraft, almost 7,000 ships took place in the invasion. And the casualties were, even though, again, the Germans did not have their full defenses, almost 5,000, so about 4,500 soldiers died on D-Day alone, just the first day of the invasion of France, including almost 2,500 Americans. So staggering amounts of death and loss of life when it came to the invasion of Normandy, which, again, is called D-Day. And that's just a general term, D-Day. It has nothing to do with anything in World War II. It's just D-Day is typically the first day of any military operation. So throughout the world history, there's been thousands of D-Days. But since this was the opening of France, it's sort of been going down in just lore as being the D-Day. So June 6, 1944 is one of those dates that you guys should always remember, because that was the beginning of the liberation of France. But despite the success, and there was success, we had huge success on D-Day, despite the high casualty rates. The actual opening and liberation of France was a slugfest. The Germans dug in, and this was sort of like their last stand as far as hanging on to their empire. And Hitler, they had blitzed their way from 39 to 44, just with steamrolling everybody in their path. So the Germans really dug in. And the United States, especially, once again, like in World War I, the United States played such a pivotal role in World War II, just with its manpower, its sheer just force and determination. And together, the American and British forces and the French forces eventually linked back up. And it took almost a year to the invasion of D-Day for the Germans to eventually to be stopped in France. And I want to get into one of the last topics I want to cover is yet another one of those conferences, because this is where you start to see the long-term thinking in the minds of Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt. And the last conference I'm going to mention in here today took place in February 1945. So while the Allies were slugging it out with the Germans, trying to fight their way towards Germany and take France, the big three met for their last time in the war. And so much comes out of this final meeting, which was called the Yalta Conference. The Yalta Conference. And the Yalta Conference took place in Eastern Europe, outside of Yugoslavia, which is a region, of course, in the Balkans. And there's so many things, so I'm going to kind of walk you through this somewhat slowly. But one of the most important points I want to bring up about the Yalta Conference stems from the fact that this is really laying the groundwork for some of the Cold War issues that we'll be talking about next week. And what I mean by that is the Allies, even though the Soviets and the British and the Americans were fighting together, the ideological differences between them, communist versus democracy, communist versus republic, communist versus capitalist, was really never going to be able to, there was always going to be that pull. And here at Yalta is when Churchill and Roosevelt really started to see that Stalin had an ulterior motive here. And one of the first points I want you to know about Yalta is that Stalin made a strong push to make sure that after the war, the Soviet Union would be able to take control of Poland. Now, poor Poland. Poland had been ravaged during the Blitzkrieg and was the first country that the Nazis invaded. And also, Poland took the largest hit of any country in terms of its civilian population, in terms of the Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust. So Poland was just completely pulled apart. And Stalin really angled towards Churchill and Roosevelt to ensure that Poland would be a Soviet territory following the war, which of course it did. So there's point number one I want you to take away from Yalta. Point number two was that the Allies laid a plan at Yalta to split Germany after the war, once it was captured, which was at this point somewhat inevitable, to split Germany into four quadrants. The United States and Britain would share those quadrants into and share the three quadrants. Meanwhile, the Soviets would receive one large quadrant. And as you guys know, at least you should be familiar, the Cold War, one of the epicenters of the Cold War was going to be Germany. And so this is, again, laying the foundation for the Cold War in that both sides are taking parts of Germany, carving them up. And then the last point about Yalta to bear in mind is the formation of the United Nations. This is the groundwork for the formation of the United Nations, which at first its headquarters was in San Francisco, and then it was eventually moved to New York City. So Yalta was where the Allies agreed to form a new world organization to replace the League of Nations, and this new world organization would be called the United Nations. So Yalta took place in February 1945. And by May of 1945, the war in Germany would be all but over. Adolf Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945, as the Soviet Union would be the military that would advance into the capital of Berlin. So the Soviet Union reached Berlin first, and it was their mission to clear out Berlin, which was a bloody conflict. One of the bloodiest battles in all of the European war took place in Berlin. Meanwhile, the Americans and the British, as they were making their way through Germany, faced the sobering reality of the concentration and death camps This is when a lot of the information about the Nazi torment of the Jewish and the genocide committed against European Jewish, Catholics, homosexuals, Soviets as well, prisoners of war were in those death camps. Just the horrific evidence that poured in during the liberation of Germany was mind-boggling. And for the most part, the majority of Americans had heard. I mean, rumors were circulating, and certainly word had gotten out about what was going on, but no one knew to the extent the extermination camps at Dachau, at Auschwitz, at Birkenau, just horrific conditions. And as I'm sure you guys have learned in the past, about 6 million lives lost in the European Holocaust, and this is when the reality of that finally was being made public. While at the same time the Soviets were entering Berlin. And on May 8th, after a week or so after Hitler's death, May 8th, Hitler surrendered. Hitler was dead. May 8th, the rest of the German army surrendered, and May 8th has now gone down in history. Hello again, money. Forever as VE Day. VE Day as in Victory in Europe Day. So there you have it. I more or less covered in about 20 minutes or so the entire European theater of war. That's going to buy us some time so that we can spend and open things up for more discussion on Wednesday. We'll be back in class tomorrow. We are in a different room, although I'm going to check and send that in the email with this as to what room we are in. So please bring questions tomorrow. I'm actually going to leave time on the table for questions tomorrow. And I'm also going to push the quiz back to Friday. So I think that's good news for you guys. It was supposed to be Thursday, but we're going to push the multiple choice quiz back to Friday because of the funkiness of the week. So hopefully you guys are cool with that. And yeah, I hope you guys have enjoyed this. I'm always happy to talk World War II. It's one of my real passions. And if you guys ever want to hit me up during tutoring or come by during a 5th hour lunch and get more in depth with this, I would love to. In the meantime, that's it for now. I hope that the student fireside chat comes out well. Have a good night. Good luck on your last day of testing tomorrow. Remember, the past shapes the future.